Good evening. A warm welcome to everyone, and I'm very pleased to see all of you here tonight for this year's Anton Wilhelm Amo lecture of the Martin Luther University in Halle-Wittenberg. My name is Olaf Zenker, and I'm Professor of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the university's Department for Anthropology and Philosophy. I'm very honored to welcome our distinguished speaker tonight, Michael Rothberg. And before introducing him, however, I would like to speak first a little bit about Anton Wilhelm Amo and also about the Amo lectures here at the University of Halle-Wittenberg. Anton Wilhelm Amo is considered the first and for a long time the only known Afro-German academic. Amo was born around 1700 in what is now Ghana and was enslaved as a young child. Via Amsterdam, he ended up as a so-called human gift from the Dutch West India Company at the court of the Duke of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel, where he was baptized Anton Wilhelm, named after the Duke and his son. While working as an African court servant, Amo also received a formal education at the court. In 1727, he took up his studies at the University of Halle at the faculties of philosophy and of law, where he completed a first Latin disputation in 1729 on the rights of Black people in Europe, with implications for Roman law practiced in Germany at the time. Subsequently, he studied and taught at the Faculty of Philosophy in Wittenberg, where he was awarded a doctorate in philosophy in 1734. His Latin dissertation is dedicated to the mind-body problem. Afterwards, Amo was admitted to the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Halle as a lecturer. 3 years later, in 1739, he also taught at the University of Jena. Little is known about his situation afterwards. Racist comments cast a shadow over Amo's situation around 1747. At that time, it is said that he left Germany for West Africa. He lived at least until 1753 in Aksum, and later Sharma in southwest Ghana, where his gravestone can be found today, which displays his year of death as 1784. In the 1960s, under the impression of the freedom among nations between the then German Democratic Republic and newly independent African post-colonial states, Amo's life and work were rediscovered and became the object of intensified research here at the University of Halle, notably by Professor Burchard-Bentjes. Since 1994, the University of Halle-Wittenberg has annually awarded the Anton Wilhelm Amo Prize for outstanding theses. And in recent years, numerous activities have emerged within our university, engaging the work and commemoration of Amo. Importantly, this very lecture hall in which we find ourselves here today was officially renamed Anton Wilhelm Amo Lecture Hall last year. So there's a memorial plaque on Amo also at the back of the lecture hall, where you can find further information of Amo. It is within this wider context of commemoration that the Anton Wilhelm Amo lectures have been organized since 2013 by the two research clusters of our university, Society and Culture in Motion, and Enlightenment, Religion, Knowledge. The Amo lectures feature internationally acclaimed scholars presenting their ongoing research on themes connected to or emanating from the work of Amo. Dedicating a lecture at our university to Anton Wilhelm Amo seems highly appropriate, given that this was, after all, his alma mater. What better way than to use a public lecture to take seriously Amo as a scholar and to remember his legacy that has been neglected and excluded for far too long. At the same time, given that the academic format of a lecture is so deeply embedded in and emblematic of the Western epistemic formation itself, the question arises, can a lecture evoke and bring into existence the potentialities of an otherwise that goes beyond the limitations of that very epistemic formation that we also want to critically interrogate and decenter? The Amo lectures want to keep open for reflection and discussion the uncanny simultaneity of an absent-present potential for lecturing on such an otherwise, on, with, through, and beyond Amo's work. For this reason, the Amo lectures draw inspiration from Jacques Derrida and his concept of under-erasure, crossing out a word while keeping it legible in order to signal its inadequate yet necessary nature. Therefore, the Amo lectures use the format of a lecture named in honor of Amo, while putting the term lecture under erasure in order to highlight its ambiguous existence as both the means for critical reflection and metonymically standing in for the Western epistemic formation itself, the potential object of such critique. This brings me directly to our distinguished speaker today. Michael Rothberg is the 1939 Society Samuel Götz Chair in Holocaust Studies and Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. His research focuses on the social and cultural implications of political violence and its afterlives, and his writings have been translated into numerous languages, including German. His important books include The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, published in 2019, Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, published in 2009, The Holocaust Reader, Theoretical Readings, which was published in 2003 as an edited volume together with Neil Levy, and Traumatic Realism, The Demands of Holocaust Representation in 2000. With Yasemin Yildiz, he's currently completing Memory Citizenship, Migrant Archives of Holocaust Remembrance. Michael Rothberg has also written for public-facing venues such as the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Los Angeles Times and The Nation, as well as German-language publications such as Die Zeit, Berliner Zeitung, and Geschichte der Gegenwart. The 2021 German translation of Multidirectional Memory prompted a national debate in the mainstream press about the relationship between the Holocaust and colonialism. This academic year, he's fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, where he's writing a book on what he calls comparison controversies. Today, building on these important projects, he will be interrogating a potential shift from memory wars to memory work. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and the floor's all yours. Thank you.
Do this. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you so much, Olaf Zenker, for inviting me to give this lecture and for that very kind introduction. And thanks to all the others who are helping with the organization today. It's truly a privilege to join this important series dedicated to and honoring Anton Wilhelm Amo. It's beautiful to do that in a room named after him, so I'm really pleased to hear about the various kinds of activities and interventions that have been taking place here, and I'm certainly humbled by the list of previous distinguished lecturers. Let me also just acknowledge the artist whose work I'll be speaking about a little bit later, Pınar Öğrenci. She actually wanted to be here tonight, but is actually filming right now in Van, Turkey. So, quick sense of what is coming, a short prologue, and then an introduction, then two main parts, one on recent debates in Germany about memory, and the second, a reading of this very beautiful film by Pınar Öğrenci. So let me begin. The Anton Wilhelm Amo lecture series, as we've just heard, takes inspiration from the French, Algerian, Jewish, you could say African also, philosopher Jacques Derrida's practice of putting some concepts under erasure. As the series website explains, and as Olaf also just told us, putting a concept under erasure entails crossing out a word while keeping it legible in order to signal its inadequate yet necessary nature. The point of such a gesture is to draw attention to the power relations embedded in language and representation more generally. The genre of the academic lecture we read on the website and have just heard has an ambiguous existence as both the means for critical reflection on the Western epistemic formation itself and as the potential object of such a critique because of the lecture form's complicity with such a hegemonic formation. While I do not possess the requisite expertise to do justice to the work and life of Anton Wilhelm Amo, I offer this lecture in the spirit of the engaged critique of hegemonic epistemic formations, as well as our implication in them, for which this series calls. Indeed, two such epistemic formations are at stake in my lecture. One that we might locate in Germany, but that is also broadly at work in the West, and one that we can locate in contemporary Turkey, but that also has transnational implications. These two formations are, it is important to emphasize, not sealed off from each other, and one goal of my lecture is to offer a critical engagement with the Turkish context as a resource for engagement with the German one. The notion of being under erasure resonates in multiple ways in my lecture tonight. In the crudest and most literal sense, the lecture you are about to hear was put under erasure when an event at the Leipzig Hochschule für Grafik und Buchkunst, where I was supposed to give a lecture with the same title, was canceled because of the political expression of one of the participants, the Palestinian artist Jumana Mana. Ironically, the canceled event was part of a series meant to confront and explore just such an urge to censor critical speech. The series, Facing the Authoritarian Drift, Art Schools as Sites of Critique, which continues this summer, was conceived in order to foster understanding of art universities as places of critical art and knowledge production, where arguments can be developed, controversies aired in public, and dissent can exist. The cancellation of our event, which was to be titled The Art of Memory in Times of Trauma and Grief, and which was eventually held in modified form in an alternative venue in Berlin, is not irrelevant to my talk today. It tells us something about the German context in which we find ourselves tonight and about which I will speak. Such second-order erasure, the cancellation of an event about cancellation, might also remind us of another concept from deconstructive theory, the mise en abîme, a figure of endless self-referentiality and mirroring, not a bad metaphor for what we see in contemporary German memory culture. But erasure is also relevant to the Turkish context addressed by the film that will be at the center of the second half of my talk, Pınar Öğrenci's Aşît, The Avalanche. Öğrenci's film documents the subtle and not so subtle forms erasure takes in the context of state violence, past and present. At the same time, the film also practices something closer to what Derrida meant by under erasure, that is, the necessity of mobilizing forms of representation despite their inadequacy as a means of subverting dominant structures of thought and power. The film's practice is, above all, aesthetic and visual, not philosophical and conceptual, but it shares Derrida's interest in traces, in that which hovers somewhere between presence and absence, and which, like a specter, haunts us without ever being fully there. In the case of the film, those spectral hauntings are traces of genocide lodged within denial and ongoing political violence, a nesting of one history inside another that we might also think of as a kind of mise en abîme. Now the introduction. It took some time, but it is now widely recognized internationally that Germany's much vaunted memory culture is in crisis. For some years, this knowledge remained primarily restricted to insiders and obsessives. I consider myself among the latter. But at least since October 7th, 2023, and all that has followed it in the German public sphere, including the attempted cancellation of New Yorker journalist Masha Gessen, who dared to compare the fates of Jews and Palestinians, the world has increasingly become conscious that something has gone terribly wrong. A memory culture once defined by a stance of admirable self-criticism and self-doubt is now characterized at the elite level by a dogmatic, repressive self-righteousness. As an emblematic shorthand for the transformation that Germany's reputation has undergone, consider the few short years between the Berlin-based Jewish-American philosopher Susan Neiman's 2019 book, Learning from the Germans, which argued, not incorrectly, that those of us in the United States could learn something about coming to terms with the past from the German model, and her October 2023 essay, Historical Reckoning Gone Haywire, which diagnoses a philo-Semitic McCarthyism that has in short order come to dominate Germany's public culture. Neiman's essay was released just before October 7th, but it points to what would become inescapable in the months leading up to our moment. The litany of scandals, cancellations, and disinvitations that target artists, writers, scholars, activists, and journalists who challenge or who are suspected of challenging certain taken-for-granted orthodoxies of contemporary German memory culture, namely the absolute singularity of the Holocaust, the unique nature of antisemitism, and the unquestioned support for the state of Israel, Staatsräson, that is thought to follow from Germany's responsibility for the Nazi genocide. Despite the patent absurdity to which this philo-Semitic McCarthyism has led, for instance, the disproportionate number of Jewish people targeted by this anti-Semitic campaign, alongside a larger number of Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, and others in solidarity with Palestinians, and despite recent shifts in messaging, especially in the face of Israel's blockage of aid to Gaza, I see no indications yet that a large-scale political or social transformation will alter the landscape in the short term. The dominant political and media classes continue to hold on to restrictive understandings of anti-Semitism, Jewishness, Israel, and the Holocaust, and thus also racism, Islam, Palestine, and colonialism, even as scholars, human rights organizations, and international legal instances point to overwhelming evidence of crimes against humanity and even genocide in Israel's assault on Gaza and continuing occupation of the West Bank. Paradoxically, despite the apparent hopelessness of the situation, alternative visions already exist across German society. In the political alliances and cultural imaginations emerging from Germany's migrant, refugee, and exile populations, as well as from critical intellectuals, activists, and artists. These alternative possibilities, however, are generally ignored, deliberately put under erasure through cancellation and sanction, or fundamentally distorted through the application of dominant interpretive frames. In this evening's talk, I will first review the dispiriting developments of the last 5 years, which have culminated in a hierarchical, partitioned memory landscape. I will then turn contrapuntally to a work of art that offers an alternative relational vision of how to think about the claims of the past and the inequities of the present. Without addressing the German context directly, Pınar Öğrenci's 2022 film Aşît, The Avalanche, nevertheless opens up much-needed space for reflection on memory, mourning, complicity, and political violence beyond the orthodoxies of the German model of coming to terms with the past. A 60-minute essay film by a recently exiled Kurdish artist from Turkey, who is now resident in Berlin, Aşît was screened first in an installation at the controversy-ridden Documenta 15 exhibition in Kassel, and was subsequently shown at the Berlinische Galerie, where I had the opportunity to see it in July 2023. Öğrenci's film depicts a highly particularized context of violence, erasure, and enforced forgetting, the Turkish Republic's perpetration and subsequent denial of the Armenian genocide, and its ongoing repression of the Kurdish minority. But its production and exhibition also located in the contemporary German context of mnemonic struggle I have been evoking. Although self-conscious about the limited agency of a singular aesthetic work, Aşît's delicate mode of relational remembrance and its weaving together of distinct stories of migration, exile, and political violence make it a work that not only allows us to remember the repressed local pasts the film depicts, but also to reconceptualize memory work in a time of national and transnational memory wars. In March 2021, the historian Jürgen Zimmerer and I published an essay in Die Zeit that was titled Enttabuisiert den Vergleich, Remove the Taboo from Comparison. The title was not ours, though a version of the phrase does appear in our text. The immediate context for our essay was a series of attacks in the German press that targeted the two of us, scholars who had never previously collaborated, had only met once almost 20 years earlier, and work in different disciplines. The occasion for the attacks was the 2021 German translation of my 2009 book, Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization. Although I know many people in Germany who welcomed the translation of the book, including artists, activists, scholars, and people working at memorial sites, the journalistic response was fierce. In prominent conservative newspapers like the Frankfurter Allgemeine and Die Welt, but also in some left-wing venues such as the Taz, I was accused of relativizing the Holocaust because I consider remembrance of the Holocaust alongside that of slavery and colonialism and in relation to ongoing processes of decolonization. Attacks on Zimmerer appeared in almost all of the responses to my book. Journalists took the occasion of the translation to rehash old debates about his argument that there are important continuities linking the Holocaust to the early 20th century genocide of the Ovaherero and Nama in today's Namibia. The larger context of these public disputes involved what has been called since summer 2020 the Historiker Streit 2.0, or the second historian's dispute, a somewhat misleading reference to the famous 1986 controversy in which Jürgen Habermas accused conservative historians, including most notoriously Ernst Nolte, of attempting to relativize the Holocaust and minimize German responsibility for the Nazis' genocidal actions. In 2020, the term Historiker Streit 2.0 was first used to describe the controversy concerning the South Africa-based Cameroonian historian and theorist Achille Mbembe, Lorenz Deutsch, a regional FDP politician, and subsequently Felix Klein, Germany's non-Jewish commissioner for Jewish life and the fight against anti-Semitism, had accused Mbembe of, quote, anti-Semitic Israel critique, Holocaust relativization, and extremist disinformation. In addition to denouncing Mbembe's alleged ties to the BDS, or Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement targeting Israel, Deutsch and Klein focused on a few decontextualized sentences from Mbembe's 2016 essay, The Society of Enmity, in which he juxtaposes, without equating, South African apartheid, the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and the Nazi genocide as different instantiations of an ethno-nationalist fantasy of separation. Deutsch and Klein called for Mbembe, who had previously won the Sophie Scholl Prize and had had many of his works translated into German, to be disinvited as a keynote speaker from the Ruhr Triennial Cultural Festival. Although the festival was canceled because of COVID-19, the accusations against Mbembe provoked an acrimonious debate in Germany and internationally, involving many dozens of opinion pieces, radio and television features, and open letters. A year after the Mbembe controversy and a few months after the attacks on multidirectional memory, the historian Dirk Moses wrote a sharp essay called The German Catechism that assessed the stakes of the ongoing controversies. Referring back to the earlier debates of 2020 and 2021, Moses diagnosed German memory culture as defined by a series of quasi-religious dictums that had become a rigid orthodoxy. An understanding of the Holocaust as a unique rupture in civilization, or Zivilisationsbruch, that entails a special German responsibility to Jews and to Israel, of anti-Semitism as distinct from other racisms, and of anti-Zionism as intrinsically anti-Semitic. Moses's point, I believe, was not that these tenets are all implausible. Who doesn't think that Germany has a special responsibility to Jews, for instance, or that the Holocaust has specific features that distinguish it from other instances of political violence? Rather, Moses was arguing that these linked propositions had become a weaponized doctrine that limits freedom of expression, shields Israel from criticism, and enables the disciplining of minorities, especially members of Palestinian and Muslim communities, but also increasingly leftist Jews, including Israelis. The German Catechism generated a lively and respectful debate in the English language online forum New Fascism Syllabus, but was highly controversial in Germany. Yet nothing that has happened since Moses's essay appeared, either before or after October 7th, contradicts Moses's insight about the disciplinary turn in German Holocaust memory culture. Indeed, the pressure on the cultural and intellectual spheres in Germany has increased radically in the past 3 years, as it has to different degrees in the US and elsewhere. In the pre-October 7th period, we see this exacerbation most famously in the controversy about Documenta 15, where the film I will discuss was first shown in 2022. Created in the wake of National Socialism, but also, as we now know, by people implicated in Nazism, Documenta was always intended to help renovate West Germany's international reputation. Documenta 15, which featured an Indonesian collective, Ruangruppe, as curators, was specifically meant to open up the German cultural sphere to what was often called the Global South. Ruangruppe used a highly decentralized mode of curation that empowered various other collectives from outside Europe to invite artists to the exhibit. In the end, over 1,500 artists took part, several times more than the usual number, and by the end of the 3-month-long exhibit, more than 70,000 people had visited Kassel, and audience satisfaction was high. This is, of course, only one part of the story. Starting several months before the opening, Ruangruppe and various other artists involved in the exhibit were subject to a virulent campaign accusing them of anti-Semitism by virtue of their presumed post-colonial perspective and alleged support of BDS. You might remember some of these images. Although most of these accusations were absurd or defamatory, when the exhibit finally opened, a prominent work by the Indonesian collective Taring Padi was in fact found to contain 1 and possibly 2 demonstrably anti-Semitic images as part of a large banner called People's Justice, focused on the Suharto dictatorship. The banner was quickly covered over and then removed, but the resulting hysteria led to a hunt for further evidence of anti-Semitism. An expert commission charged with evaluating the artworks determined that among the thousands of works of art, there were 4 that could be described as including anti-Semitic elements. Beyond Taring Padi's People's Justice, the other works all concerned Israel-Palestine and were thus open to conflicting interpretations about the border between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. There's much to be said about the Documenta crisis, but the key point here is its symptomatic nature. While it took 65 years until the first public accounting of Documenta's Nazi roots, almost half of those who worked on the first Documenta were members of the Nazi Party, SS or SA, even that revelation did not provoke the crisis that the anti-Semitic motifs did in 2022. A clear index of the special scrutiny given to those Muslims always already presumed to be anti-Semitic. Quickly generalized from a few disturbing, if isolated, images to a thoroughgoing delegitimization of the entire exhibit, as well as of post-colonialism and the Global South as such, the controversy demonstrated the difficulty, perhaps impossibility, of having a substantive discussion in Germany among international actors that does not simply take the tenets of the German Catechism for granted. That is, whatever one makes of the particular artworks at stake, the true scandal was the inability to talk about the relation between different conceptions of racism, anti-Semitism, and the politics of aesthetics. As if to prove the point, a panel series that was supposed to take up these issues was canceled after objections from the Central Committee of Jews in Germany. The series, you will recall, was called We Need to Talk. Such ironies have been visible throughout the so-called Historiker Streit 2.0. When Simmerer and I published our article calling for the destigmatization or detabooization of comparison, the public response was aggressively dismissive. The same journalists who had been attacking my multi-directional approach to memory and Simmerer's comparative approach to history now told us that there were no strictures on comparison after all. Writing in a collective volume that responded harshly to Moses' Catechism essay, the prominent Holocaust historian Sibylle Steinbacher castigated Simmerer and me by saying straightforwardly, there simply is no taboo on comparison. And that's, here we go, there's one slide behind. In contrast, when I described our essay to colleagues outside Germany, the response was the diametrical opposite. Of course there's a taboo on comparison, everyone said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. How can we make sense of that polarized response? I think there are three questions to consider. In what contexts do comparisons take place? How does taboo function? And what do we mean by comparison? First, the question of context. Steinbacher refuted the idea of a comparison taboo by referring to the plentiful scholarship in comparative genocide studies. But our essay targeted public discourses on the Holocaust in Germany, not the work of academics, which we obviously know is comparative. Contexts vary. Second, the question of taboo. For something to count as taboo, there must be a sanction for its violation. Obviously, there is no consistent sanction for the act of comparing the Holocaust, even in Germany. But if we consider just two of the cases I have mentioned, it is obvious that both Achille Mbembe and Masha Gessen were sanctioned because of provocative Holocaust comparisons contained in their writings, comparisons that in both cases touch on Palestine. Taboos do not necessarily function in an absolute way. Gessen, after all, did receive their prize in the end, but in a private setting instead of Bremen's town hall, and without the backing of the Bull Stiftung, one of the prize's prominent sponsors. Even in their partial form, however, and perhaps especially so, taboos act as deterrents that shape the limits of the publicly sayable. Finally, the question of comparison. At least in contemporary Germany, the mode of comparison matters a great deal. As I have learned over the past few years, Holocaust comparisons are indeed permissible in the German context, but only if they take very particular forms. Most prominently, the use of contrast to demonstrate, via comparison, that the Holocaust is unique in human history and thus, well, incomparable. Since October 7th, however, it has also been permissible to compare the Holocaust to the Hamas attacks, which have frequently been referred to with the Holocaust-specific terminology of the Zivilisationsbruch. What remains taboo, however, are comparisons that work relationally, not simply the enumeration of similarities and differences that conclude with the repetition of what we already know, that the Holocaust and antisemitism are unique, but comparisons that evoke unexpected kinships, for example, between the suffering of Jews and non-Jews, structural similarities, genealogical continuities, or warnings for the future. If taboo involves the policing of unwanted contact, the assertion of relationality raises the possibility of unanticipated proximity, one that in German Holocaust memory culture often triggers sanction. A particularly charged site of relationality in Germany as elsewhere is migration and the so-called post-migrant society, a society transformed by multiple histories of migration. Memory culture itself represents a significant realm for negotiating the impact of migration, especially in a country where memory of the Holocaust has become so central to conceptions of national identity and citizenship. In 2011, Yasemin Yildiz and I diagnosed what we called the German paradox, a dominant understanding that confronting the Nazi past entails holding on to the very conception of ethnic Germanness that was one of the sources of Nazi crimes in the first place. We also observed the emergence of a migrant double bind in which migrants and racialized minorities are told that they must remember the Holocaust to become German, but that they cannot remember the Holocaust because they are not really German. More recently, Esra Uzyarek has explored this logic ethnographically and described the subcontracting of guilt that leads majority German society to offload responsibility for the Holocaust and anti-Semitism onto already stigmatized migrants and post-migrants of Muslim background, an offloading that was clearly visible in the documenta controversy. Despite the force of these paradoxes, double binds, and forms of stigmatization, however, post-migrant Germany remains a site where multiple memories and memory traditions jostle against each other in unexpected ways. What Yasemin Yildiz calls the multiple frames of migrant remembrance create unexpected kinships and inorganic genealogies, in short, new forms of relationality, that, unsurprisingly, often trouble German conceptions of memory culture and thus either fly under the radar or attract disciplinary sanction. I want to turn now to an artwork marked by migration that can help us think relationally about the remembrance of multiple histories of political violence and break out of the national frames that constrain our understanding of memory cultures. In Aşît, which was commissioned by Documenta 15 and the Saha Association in Turkey, Berlin-based artist Pınar Öğrenci returns to her father's birthplace, Mukus, a remote town in eastern Turkey, in order to excavate entangled, highly local experiences of Kurds and Armenians that also intersect with transnational histories of political violence, migration, and exile. A Kurdish artist and activist from Van, the city to which her father had migrated, Öğrenci fled the country of her birth in 2018 after being subjected to a 2-year-long trial and the threat of 18 years in prison because of her engagement with feminist politics and the Kurdish question. After months of traveling between Oslo, Brussels, Vienna, and Athens, she settled in Berlin, a base from which she has created a series of films and installations that reflect on histories of migration and persecution. For Aşît, Öğrenci employs observational and poetic modes that mix mostly stationary documentary shots with selected archival images. English subtitles convey the personal narrative of the artist along with political and historical context. The soundtrack, meanwhile, combines ambient sounds from the country and city with off-screen, non-synchronous interviews in Kurdish, and crucially, several songs, one filmed synchronically in Kurdish and the others in Armenian, taken from archival recordings. This complex, multi-layered montage of visual, verbal, and oral elements constitutes the formal means through which the film engages in what I am calling memory work. Without explicitly addressing the German context in which it was produced, Aşît puts into practice just those modes of comparative and connective remembrance that we often find in migrant spaces and that agitate the contemporary memory wars. Indeed, the film's memory work stands in stark contrast to the tenor of contemporary German memory culture. If the dominant form of German memory has become rigid, self-righteous, and self-enclosed in a restrictive national paradigm and defined by taboos and a punishing aggressivity, the film possesses an inquisitive, self-critical, and multi-directional sensibility that manages to be both deeply political and gently contemplative. At the same time, however, some aspects of the film's project do have affinities with the grassroots and citizen-initiated memory work that characterized German grappling with the Holocaust in the 1980s, before it became ritualized and incorporated into the state. Like those grassroots movements, Aşît explores and seeks to commemorate unmarked local sites that bear witness to political violence and the erasure of minority cultures. As an emblem of those affinities, we might keep in mind the famous image of memory activists performatively digging at the site of the former Gestapo headquarters in Berlin, a site that was then unmarked, but that would, through their efforts, become the topography des terrors. Öğrenci's film also mobilizes the performative force of digging as a way of signaling the need to excavate buried histories. In a scene that provides the film's signature image, an S-shaped line of Kurdish men sets out with shovels to clear a mountain path blocked by snow. I want to play you a clip from the video, and I'm hoping that the sound is going to come through. We can check the sound. Let's see what happens.
میکس ولایت که قدیمه وقتی بریه دا پرسان، ارمنیان، کردان گلهب لها جوینه جیانا خبر دوام کرنه بریا وانداجی قرار تو لها هبینه قدر میکسی همه سر جغرافیوی هاتیه چیکرن هاتیه شکل کرد جبروی قاسه ری مکسی برای نهادا قاسه نه مهان تما گرتی
While a Kurdish interviewee recounts how in the past Persians, Armenians, and Kurds used to live together here, the men clear the path and sing a song called Malan Barkir, whose lyrics speak of loved ones parting, households moving to distant lands, and mice and snakes eating people's flesh. Popular among Kurds, the song is also for Armenians a lament that commemorates the great disaster of genocide. Beneath the snow, the film suggests indirectly, is a past rendered amnesiac. As we hear the song, the interviewee continues by informing us that even today the region is beset by avalanches that continue to claim dozens of lives. The Kurdish word that gives the film its title, Aşît, avalanche, also means disaster, and thus evokes the Armenian catastrophe as well as these recent natural deaths. This scene foregrounds dramatic local geography and tragic history, but what Öğrenci excavates in Aşît ultimately exceeds the kind of local histories that were the focus of the 1980s German memory activists and opens up relational, transnational vistas from which current German memory discourses could learn. In Aşît, Öğrenci probes peripheral locations and identifies exile and involuntary migration as nodes of relationality that connect, without equating, Armenians, Kurds, and more surprisingly, Jews. She does not simply approach these relational nodes from the outside, but rather self-reflexively situates herself in proximity to the histories she uncovers. Although we neither see the filmmaker nor hear her voice, she frames Aşît through a personal textual narrative rendered in English. Shortly after the film's title appears, we look down into a valley surrounded by imposing snow-covered mountains that are shrouded in clouds. At the top right corner of the screen, a series of 3 narrative subtitles announces, "My father wanted to see Mukus, the hometown that he left when he was 10, one last time before he passed away. But because the roads to Mukus are closed off during winter and dangerous during summer, he was unable to go. When the first asphalt road was laid in 2013, my father had already passed away." The film then can be seen as taking up an intergenerational quest that has been frustrated by blocked paths and death. Yet, while a return to Mukus was impossible for the narrator's father, the film itself constitutes evidence of the narrator's temporary return to this site. It is thus a work of post-memory, but one that combines what Mariana Hirsch calls familial and affiliative forms. If the attempt to re-embody the story of her father is an act of familial post-memory, her work of affiliative post-memory includes the former Armenian community of Moks, as the town was called in Armenian. At the same time, Öğrenci modulates that post-memorial affiliation through a forthright acknowledgement of Kurdish implication in the genocide. In an interview, she describes how she feels her hometown of Van died after the disaster of 1915, and goes on to say that when you grow up in this kind of city where you can't talk about the past, its former people and culture, you feel like you are part of the guilt. Having this strange guilt on my shoulders since my youth brought me to the 3,300-meter high mountains which covered my father's town, Mukus. In Aşît, Öğrenci transforms these feelings of guilt into a complex work of mourning that acknowledges Kurdish participation and implication in the great disaster, as well as the way that the state solicits similar forms of complicity in the repression of Kurds today. Although set entirely in Mukus and infused with this sense of implication and responsibility, Aşît is a work created from a position of political exile, and the fact of exile influences both the form and the content of the work. While the film most obviously concerns Turkish memory wars about the Armenian genocide, along with hot wars in the Kurdish region, it was produced in Germany. This extraterritorial location provides space for a critical engagement with the gaps in official Turkish memory. But it also means that we can read the film in relation to its exilic context as an implicit, even unintentional, intervention into the German memory wars. Öğrenci's German exile has clearly influenced her artistic production, as a series of works up to her most recent exhibitions in Hamburg and Berlin demonstrate. Even before her arrival in Berlin, however, the artist was already attuned to the transnational entanglements of Germany and Turkey. Citing Germany's alliance with the Ottoman Empire in World War I and Hitler's famous quip, "Who remembers the Armenians today?" Öğrenci remarks in an interview that the relationship between our political histories also motivated me to be inspired by German literature, an inspiration we find prominently displayed in Aşît. Öğrenci's exilic location combines with her sense of Turkish-German historical and cultural relationality to lend Aşît a multi-directional sensibility that stands in stark contrast to the insistence on the absolute singularity of the Holocaust that drives recent German memory culture. This sensibility emerges from unexpected sights. Throughout the film, recurrent shots show groups of men intently playing chess in the town's cafes, but it takes time for the resonance of these shots to emerge. Chess, we are told, is a game that may have been brought to the region centuries earlier by Arab invasions, and that has been played by men, women, and children of all ethnicities in Mukus. But chess is not only a local pastime linked to larger regional histories of conquest, it also constitutes a reference to a non-local history, that of National Socialism and the Holocaust. In interviews, Öğrenci frequently mentions her interest in Benjamin and Brecht's epistolary exchanges about chess during their exile from Nazi Germany. More explicitly in the film, Öğrenci deploys subtitles to evoke the Austrian Jewish author Stefan Zweig's novella about chess, Schachnovella, translated as The Royal Game, which he wrote in 1941, 1 year before his suicide in exile. While the camera zooms in on chess players' faces and hands, the narrator tells us that when she discovered Mukus's cafes, it was as if I was in the book The Royal Game that I had read as a child. She continues, Stefan Zweig wrote the book during the days of his escape from the Nazis, seeking asylum in Brazil. In Portuguese, xadrez means both chess and prison. While writing his book, Zweig must have been inspired by this polysemy. At the mention of Portuguese polysemy, the camera leaves the cafe and we see heavily armed patrolling soldiers and the interior of a Turkish state building filmed to emphasize its sterile and prison-like appearance. After recounting the plot of Schachnovella, which involves a lawyer imprisoned by and then in exile from the Nazis, the narrator informs us that, quote, in 2017, the government dismissed the opposing Kurdish mayors and replaced them with their own people. Today, most of the elected mayors are either in prison or exile. Chess becomes an occasion to reference an exiled cosmopolitan writer who, in George Mossey's words, knew no nations, as well as a minority persecuted by the Turkish nation-state. It thus represents a multi-directional switch point through which flight from the Nazis during the Holocaust sharpens the film's account of anti-Kurdish persecution in the present without suggesting that those two experiences are in any way identical. Such multi-directional remembrance, anathema to dominant German sensibilities focused on the Holocaust's singularity, takes time to emerge. The film practices a particular form of slow cinematic memory work that decodes and resignifies seemingly silent traces of the past. For instance, the film opens with a 2-minute sequence of 7 stationary shots, both long shots of the sky, trees, and mountains, and close-ups of snow, stone ruins, and a herd of sheep, all accompanied by the sounds of howling wind, dripping water, and gently falling snow. These shots are picturesque but initially opaque. The film's subsequent shift from this highly localized, almost motionless portrait of a particular ecology to a dense depiction of the relationality of past and present state violence mimics the surfacing of suppressed memories from the snows of oblivion. The film enacts such a surfacing through one of its most striking formal techniques, a technique that I believe one can compare to Derrida's practice of deploying the concepts under erasure. In several key moments, documents or archival photographs emerge from the documentary footage of the landscape and slowly become legible. In one scene toward the middle of the film, Armenian script and the outlines of Armenian settlements appear superimposed on an otherwise barren brown hill across which the camera tracks while a Kurdish interviewee reads out the names of former Armenian villages from the region. So let me show that clip as well.
Ağin, Anapat, Ağmış, Eskencans, Par, Pernüt, Getris, Ginakos, Kumas, Dimkor, Taramah, Lacan, Lulis, Kassel, Gerkiços, Giçov, Akilvan, Averis, İr, Gazeplü, Nuravos, Merakos, Nanis, Sip, Soks, Sıpkos, Petatir. همه گنده ارمنیان نیمکسینه
همه نوی گنده اونه دی ارمنیان.
The knowledge we acquire in this shot of destroyed Armenian villages lends weight to the opening scenes of ruins and carved stones, which we now cannot avoid understanding as material remnants, as traces of genocidal destruction. A similar resignification of natural signs takes place in relation to the sheep we see early on. In the opening sequence, the sheep appear in harmony with the landscape and with traditional village lifeways. Eventually, the film teaches us that this particular way of life is being eroded by anti-Kurdish state violence and climate change, which have forced many peasants to abandon their land and livestock and migrate into the city or farther afield. A key scene supplements these present tense forms of forced displacement with an additional association. The sheep also call up the forgotten traces of eradicated Armenian culture. In a late sequence, a herd of sheep grazes by a rushing river and across from an imposing digger, itself symptomatic of the destruction of the landscape. The camera then moves into the animal's hut. As the camera pans over the sheep, staying close to them and positioned around eye level, another off-screen Kurdish interviewee begins to describe the different animals. The ones with the horns are known as kils. Those with no horns and with small ears are kurs. The interviewee proceeds to name 15 different kinds of sheep, Hemdani, Kir, Serash, Kerekash, etc., all of which are distinguished by physical features such as the presence and absence of horns and the color of their mouths and eyes. He then clarifies, these names have entered our culture from Persian or Armenian. Because many words have no equivalent in Kurdish, we do not know the meanings of these names. The names, in other words, refer to the sheep, but they do not possess meaning for the speaker, a peculiar linguistic form that the film exposes and struggles against by highlighting a paradoxical transmission of cultural memory. The varieties of sheep represent a trace of cultural relationality that lives on despite the forces of violence and erasure that have sought to eliminate non-Turkish language, culture, and often enough people. Conveyed in a Kurdish language narrative, the names of the sheep transmit that trace of relationality, but also reveal the genocidal loss that haunts cultural transmission. The memory of the Armenian and Persian past lives on. The memory of the Armenian and Persian past lives on as sounds whose meaning has been lost. In drawing our attention to this peculiar form of transmission without meaning and identifying genocide and state violence as the force behind these processes of designification, the film remediates the lost memory, not to bring it to fullness, but to suggest the fullness of what has been lost. Aşît is a work that searches for traces of the past against the forces of violence in the present and in the face of blocked access to the past. In addition to the recitation of Armenian villages and animal names by current Kurdish residents of Mukus, Armenian is present primarily through the voice of Hayrik Muradian, who survived the genocide of his people as a young boy from the neighboring town of Chatak, one of 4 survivors out of a family of 54, the narrator tells us. After his family settled in Armenia, he made it his life's work to collect the songs of his childhood. 3 of those songs accompany the film, and 2 are translated in English subtitles. In one instance, lyrics recounting the destruction of home are set against a snow-covered mountain in a shot that resembles the sequence recounting the narrator's story of her father's failed return home. As if to emphasize that connection, the narrator informs us that both her father and Muradian left their homes at age 10. Öğrenci has also remarked that Hayrik means father in Armenian. Once again, we have the sense that this is a work of affiliative post-memory, but the affiliation is a charged one that requires engaged working through. Aşît returns Muradian's voice to the landscape that once held a thriving Armenian community, but it does so self-consciously through montage, through the filmmaker's ability to edit together non-synchronous sounds and images. Despite this partial return, there is nothing cathartic or redemptive about the direction in which the film moves. From its initial stunning shots of the town's natural setting, the film builds toward a recognition that the catastrophe of 1915 was a turning point in the erasure of Armenian Moks, as one of the last subtitles reads. This recognition of the town as a site of catastrophe, really several catastrophes as the film has shown us, is also another moment that inspires multidirectionality. Earlier, as we have seen, the film associated chess with Stefan Zweig's Exile from the Nazis. Now, immediately following the reference to the 1915 genocide, a series of subtitles, the final 3 of the film, evoke the Holocaust survivor and psychoanalyst Dori Laub and link his theory of trauma and testimony to Hayrik Muradian. Set against a dark cave and the sound of dripping water, we read, Dori Laub says that communities that have experienced major traumas like genocide need to be listened to gently, ears appropriate for listening. The voice of Muradian, who could never return to his homeland, was one of those voices for me. The voice of trauma and the unspeakable. At this point, there's a brief pause, and then we hear the elegiac voice of Muradian singing I Am a Deer of the Highlands, the 3rd and final Armenian song included in Aşît, but without a translation, as if to reinforce the notion of the unspeakable. After a few seconds, the image track shifts to an ordinary Mukus street scene. The camera appears to be mounted on the back of a truck, and a continuous shot documents the filmmaker leaving town. So here's a clip that's the very end of the film, just before the credits roll.
Ոչքերդ վար կանթեղ ընկվեր տանանակ բաժնի գդչինարի պատկերդ լուսնակ քեզ թանեմ աղթամար սուրբ խաչի համար Սուրբ խաչ տամեզ իլաչ անուն մխիթար Սուրբ խաչ տամեզ իլաչ անուն մխիթար Ես ախարով էր յարմալուլեր հանքախնջզիկ իշկեր իմ սրտին
From the town center, with pedestrians and shops visible, we pass police cars and barricades deployed in front of state offices at the side of the road. As the camera moves over a bridge, an older man half turns around and waves, and then the camera moves out into the countryside. The screen fades to black, and the credits roll, accompanied by Muradian's untranslated song. This final sequence encapsulates much about the particular mode of Aşît's memory work. Through a careful montage of image and sound, the film creates a multidirectional constellation of violent histories, including the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, the repression of Kurds, and even anti-Black racism, which is present via an oblique reference to Chantal Akerman's 1999 film South, which concludes with a similar shot from the back of a truck that traces the path on which an African-American man, James Byrd Jr., was dragged by a lynch mob. And Akerman is herself, of course, the daughter of Holocaust survivors. Yet despite this manifest multidirectional relationality, Aşît's dislocation of sound and image suggests the limits of mnemonic reparation in the face of denial, trauma, and ongoing military occupation. An exiled Armenian voice, English language subtitles evoking the Holocaust, barely glimpsed scenes of military repression in a remote town, an intertextual reference to a modern-day lynching. These cinematic materials are invested with forms of historical content that resonate, but in their formal distinctness are deliberately prevented from melting into each other. Grasping both their connection and their unredeemable separation requires a particular form of perception that Aşît also seeks to supply. The film has indeed taught us to listen gently to multiple traumas, a training that its quiet early scenes of nature began to impart to us before we even knew the violent content, buried in the snowy landscape and visible in the texture of contemporary everyday life in the Kurdish regions. I'll come to a short conclusion. When Jürgen Zimmerer and I responded to our critics in the Zeit essay I discussed earlier, our concern was not only with the taboo regulating comparison, but also with an underlying intellectual atmosphere in Germany characterized by a willful embrace of provincialism. The insistence on the absolute singularity and incomparability of the Holocaust that drives the memory wars has served not only to isolate the Shoah from other genocides, but also to narrow the scope of German opinion and even German identity as expressed in the German paradox. One of the stranger responses to the 2021 translation of multidirectional memory came in an essay by the FAZ journalist Claudius Seidel, who wrote that, quote, Rothberg cannot take away our German responsibility. Such a bizarre misunderstanding ignores the fact that opening up German memory culture leads precisely to the expansion of German responsibility to include colonial crimes and other entanglements in political violence from Armenia to Palestine, not to its minimization. This embrace of provincialism corresponds to a denial of relationality beyond the ethnic and the culturally familiar. Such a rearguard attempt to bolster the borders of Germanness has only intensified in the years since, even as Germany's implication in political violence has continued to deepen. I have turned to Pınar Öğrenci's film as an antidote to such provincialism. Although Aşît focuses on the provinces of remote eastern Turkey and is attuned to the very particular resonances of the local environment, it is, as a work of art, the farthest thing from provincial. Even more, it shows Mukus to be a town that harbors a strong cosmopolitan legacy, albeit one beset by a genocidal violence that has almost, but not completely, erased its entangled histories. In a brilliant response to an earlier version of this lecture, Sonali Thakkar of New York University drew my attention to an essay by Mashinka Firuns Hakopian called Where Scenes of Catastrophe Reappear, on Armenian and Palestinian solidarities. Writing in the wake of both the expulsion of more than 100,000 Armenians from Artsakh in September 2023 and the destruction and displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza that began a month later, Hakopian evokes the recursive nature of colonial violence and of the images of it that seem to repeat themselves across centuries of Armenian and Palestinian history. She points out how diptychs of images of Armenian and Palestinian suffering in the 20th and 21st centuries circulated simultaneously across digital media in the fall 2023. Images that also echo, as Thakkar pointed out, scenes in Aşît. Although Hakopian expresses appropriate skepticism that simply viewing regime-made disasters will constitute a galvanizing force that will affect change, she nevertheless insists that such juxtaposed images can bind us to powerful historical and political imperatives. Quote, placed alongside one another, these images become a grid of interlocking attempted erasures undone by refusals to be erased. These scenes demand the cultivation of dauntless solidarities, a praxis of collective witnessing, and coalitional action, unquote. The question that Thakkar raised in referring to Hakopian's text was whether we could extend the Kurdish-Armenian solidarities implied in Aşît to the Armenian-Palestinian solidarity evoked by Hakopian, and whether we could read into Aşît a knowledge of disasters, like the one in Gaza, that it could not have registered when it was made years earlier. There is, after all, according to Hakopian, a particular form of intuitive knowledge that accrues for descendants witnessing the recursion of colonial violence. I agree with Thakkar that such a knowledge is at work in Öğrenci's film, and that it can help us expand the bonds of multidirectional solidarity by linking the Kurdish question to the Palestinian one across the common reference point of the Armenian catastrophe. There is a potential here for a radical cosmopolitan solidarity, albeit one that comes without guarantees. Aşît refuses provincialism, but it acknowledges and dwells on the violent conditions in which provincialism flourishes, conditions we must all take seriously today. In referencing Stefan Zweig, the film calls up a figure who stands for an enlightened cosmopolitan tradition associated with German culture, as George Mosse details in his book German Jews Beyond Judaism. Yet the film's pursuit of cosmopolitan pasts extends far beyond the unpolitical, liberal individualism that Mosse finds in Zweig. Öğrenci's cosmopolitanism, if that is the right word, is ecological more than human. Its traces are encoded in landscapes, animal life, multiple languages, music, and material culture. Aşît does not pretend that it can reanimate the lost cosmopolitanisms it excavates, but in remembering relationally, it reveals what has been lost, exposes the forces of violence that seek to suppress memory, and teaches us to look and listen gently for possibilities of repair. If Aşît means avalanche and disaster, it is also very close to the Kurdish word Aşîti, which means peace. As Öğrenci's film attests, it is often in the memory work of migrants, refugees, and minorities in Germany that we find powerful reparative alternatives to the memory wars, inspirational forms of grassroots memory activism, and the kinds of cosmopolitan worlds that genocidal regimes always seek to eradicate. Thank you.